The Romanovs. Order was established in February 1613 when Mihailo I, son of Patriarch Filaret, was elected to the throne. He was elected by the will of the National Assembly, which consisted of representatives of 50 Russian cities and representatives of the peasantry. The Romanov dynasty ruled Russia until 1917. The first task of the new dynasty was to establish order. Fortunately for the Russians, their archenemies the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Sweden were at war with each other at the time, which allowed the Russians to conclude peace with Sweden in 1617 and a truce with the Poles in 1619. They regained their lost territories in the mid-17th century, after the Bogdan uprising Khmelnytsky against the Polish authorities in Ukraine. By the agreement in Pereyaslav, January 1654. Between Tsar Alexei and the Cossack hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, the Cossack hetmanate was annexed to Russia. This was the reason for the further continuation of the Russo-Polish War, which ended with the peace in Andrusovo. With that peace, Poland returned Smolensk, Kiev and eastern Ukraine to Russia. During this period, the state gradually abolished the right of peasants to change the property they work on. The state completely controlled the serfs, who, by escaping from the property to which they were bound, became outlaws. The landowners had almost unlimited power over their serfs. The nobility and the state increased the levies on the peasants. Taxes were also increased on merchants and they were prohibited, like serfs, from moving to another area. The entire population was included in military conscripts, and they were also obliged to pay special taxes. In such conditions, rebellions were frequent. Even the population of Moscow rose up against the government several times. The largest peasant revolt in Europe in the 17th century broke out in 1667. Then the Cossacks rebelled against the centralization of the state, and escaped serfs joined them. The Cossack Stanka Razin led his insurgents along the Volga, revolting the peasants and replacing the local government with the Cossack one. The imperial army crushed the uprising in 1670. A year later, Stanka was captured and executed. Peter the Great. Peter I the Great, 1672–1725, consolidated autocracy in Russia and played a major role in creating a state based on the European system. Russia was the largest country in the world, its area was equal to the area of 3 continental Europe. It stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Pacific Ocean. Most of the territorial expansion was achieved in the 17th century, when the first Russian settlements were created on the Pacific Ocean. Kiev was returned again and the Siberian tribes were pacified. At that time, Russia had only 14 million inhabitants, of which only a small part lived in cities. Russia remained excluded from maritime trade, and internal trade depended on weather conditions. Peter's first military goals were directed against the Ottoman Empire. Later he turns his attention to the north. Peter lacked a safe seaport in the north, next to the port of Arkhangelsk on the White Sea, which was under ice for 9 months of the year. The exit to the Baltic was blocked by Sweden. The desire for access to the sea led him to form a secret alliance with the Polish-Lithuanian Union and Denmark against Sweden in 1699, which led to the Great Northern War. The war ended in 1721 when an exhausted Sweden sued for peace. Peter received 4 provinces to the south and east of the Gulf of Finland, thus securing for himself the long-desired access to the sea. There he erected the new Russian capital, St. Petersburg, as a window to Europe to replace Moscow, which had long been Russia's cultural center. In honor of his conquests, Peter adds the title of emperor and the Russian Empire officially becomes the Russian Empire in 1721. Peter reorganized the state according to the latest models from the West and turned Russia into an absolutist state. He replaced the old Bolar Duma, Council of the Nobility, with a 9-member Senate, which was the supreme council of the state. The country was divided into new provinces and districts. Peter ordered the Senate to collect taxes. Tax revenues tripled during his reign. As part of the reforms, the Russian Orthodox Church was partially incorporated into the administrative structure of the state, thus becoming a tool of the state. Peter abolished the title of Patriarch and replaced it with a joint body, the Holy Synod, governed by state officials. In the meantime, the remnants of local self-government were removed, and Peter continued and intensified the demands of his predecessors for state service for all the nobility. Peter died in 1725, leaving the succession question unsettled. His reign opened up the issues of Russia's backwardness, its relationship with the West, and other important problems that many rulers who came after him had to face. Nevertheless, he laid the foundations of the modern Russian state. Russia from 1725 to 1825. Almost 50 years had to pass before an ambitious and cruel ruler appeared on the Russian throne. Catherine II was a German princess who married the Russian crown prince. When she discovered that he was incapacitated, she gave tacit permission for his murder. It was announced that he died of apoplexy, and in 1762 Catherine came to the throne. Catherine contributed to the revival of the Russian nobility that began after the death of Peter the Great. The civil service was abolished and the nobles were given most of the state positions in the provinces. Catherine the Great extended Russian political influence over the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth by supporting the Targovic Confederation, although the costs of doing so were enormous. Supporting that confederation with a tyrannical social system that required serfs to work almost all the time on the master's land led to a major peasant uprising in 1773. The immediate reason for the uprising was the legalization of the sale of serfs separately from the land. Led by another Cossack, Yemelyan Pugachev, with cries of "Let's hang all the landowners," the uprising threatened to engulf Moscow as well, before it was bloodily put down. Catherine ordered Pugachev to be strangled and dismembered in Red Square, but all those measures did not produce results and new rebellions constantly threatened both her and her successors. She waged successful wars against the weakened Ottoman Empire and expanded Russia's southern border towards the Black Sea. Having entered into an alliance with the rulers of the Austrian Empire and Prussia, during the partition of Poland, it appropriated half of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and moved the Russian border to the west, into Central Europe itself. By the time of her death in 1796, Catherine's policy of conquest had turned Russia into one of the greatest European powers. Territorial expansion continued with the conquests of Alexander I, who seized Finland from the weakened Swedish kingdom in 1809 and Bessarabia from Turkey in 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte made a big mistake when, after the conflict with Tsar Alexander I, he set out to conquer Imperial Russia in 1812. This campaign was disastrous for Napoleon. Unable to destroy the Russian army, which avoided direct clashes and used scorched earth tactics. By capturing Moscow, Napoleon tried to force Alexander I to negotiate. Due to the terribly cold Russian weather, and the lack of preparation for the winter conditions of warfare, thousands of French soldiers died in the snow. Using guerrilla warfare, the Russians forced them to retreat, and then pursued them through Central and Western Europe all the way to Paris. After the Allied victory over Napoleon, in which the Russian side bore the brunt, Alexander I became known as the savior of Europe. After the Congress of Vienna, the greater part of the Warsaw Voivodeship belonged to Russia. As the Russian Empire played a political role during the 19th century, enabled by its victory over Napoleon's France, the maintenance of feudal relations made any economic progress possible. While the economic development of Western Europe accelerated during the Industrial Revolution, which began in the second half of the 18th century, Russia fell further and further behind the rest of Europe, which created additional imperial problems. December Revolution. Although Russia was a great power, its government was ineffective in many respects, the people were poor, and the economy was underdeveloped. After the victory over Napoleon, Alexander I planned to implement constitutional reforms. Although he tried to implement some, the most necessary ones were not even attempted. Nikolai I. Romanov, 1825–1855, who was faced with an uprising at the beginning of his reign, had relatively liberal beliefs. The background of this uprising lies in the Napoleonic Wars when a large number of military officers toured Europe as part of military campaigns, where contact with the liberalism of Western Europe encouraged them to seek change on their return to Russia. The result of this was the December Uprising, December 1825, which was the work of a small circle of liberal nobles and military officers who wanted to enthrone Nicholas's brother as a constitutional monarch. However, the uprising was easily suppressed, which is why Nicholas had to abandon the modernization program started by Peter the Great, and protect the maximum autocracy, orthodoxy, and respect of the people. The Russian Tsar also had to deal with uprisings in the newly acquired territories of Congress Poland, which saw the November Uprising of 1830, and the January Uprising of 1863. Schism and reaction. The brutal retaliation for the uprising made December the 14th a day long remembered by later revolutionary movements. In order to suppress future uprisings, schools and universities were under constant surveillance. Police spies were everywhere. Potential revolutionaries were sent to Siberia, especially during the reign of Nicholas I, when hundreds of thousands of them were sent to labor camps. In this situation, Mikhail Bakunin appears as the father of anarchism. He left Russia for Western Europe in 1842, where he became an activist of the socialist movement. After participating in the May Uprising in Dresden in 1849, he was arrested and sent to Siberia, but managed to escape from there and return to Europe. In Europe, he begins to collaborate with Karl Marx, despite significant ideological and tactical differences. The question of the direction of Russia has been topical since Peter the Great's program of rapprochement with the West. Some were supporters of imitating Europe, while others turned their backs on the West and sought a return to the traditional past. This second path was blazed by Slavophiles who ignited contempt for the decadent West. Slavophiles were opponents of bureaucracy. They preferred the collectivism of the medieval Russian peace and the village community over the individualism of the West. Alexander II. Tsar Nicholas died leaving behind many unresolved issues. A year before, Russia took part in the Crimean War, which was fought primarily on the Crimean Peninsula. Having played a major role in Napoleon's defeat, Russia was considered an invincible military power, but in contrast suffered significant losses due to the weakness of Tsar Nicholas' regime. When Alexander II came to the throne in 1855, there was a need for urgent reforms. An advanced humanitarian movement, later associated with the abolitionist movement in the U.S. before the American Civil War, sought the abolition of serfdom. During 1859, it was estimated that there were more than 23 million serfs in Russia. Entire Russia had about 69 million inhabitants, who lived in worse conditions than the peasantry in Western Europe in the 16th century. Alexander II decided to abolish serfdom and not wait for it to be abolished by revolution. The Russian Emancipation Reform of 1861 is the most significant event in Russian history of the 19th century. It was the beginning of the end of the monopoly of the aristocracy over the land. The reform brought an influx of labor to the cities, stimulated industrial production, the number of members of the middle class increased, as well as their influence. However, instead of receiving land, freed peasants had to pay taxes collected by the state. And landowners were paid a modest sum for the properties they lost. In most cases, peasants received the worst land. All the land that was handed over to the peasants was collectively owned by the peace, the village community, which divided the land and supervised the possessions. Although serfdom was abolished, its results did not favor the peasants, so revolutionary tensions were not reduced, despite the intention of Alexander II. During 1876, a rebellion broke out in the Ottoman Empire in the Balkans. The Russian population massively sided with the Serbian and Bulgarian brothers, so Russia again entered the war with Turkey. The entry into the war increased tensions between Russia and Austria-Hungary, which also had territorial claims in the Balkans. During this period, Russia expanded its territories in Central Asia, which was rich in raw materials, as well as in the Caspian Lake region. Nihilism. Around 1860, a movement known as the Nihilist movement developed in Russia. Many Russian liberals were not satisfied with the empty speeches of the intelligentsia. Nihilists questioned old values and defended the independence of individuals. The Nihilists first tried to win over the aristocracy. When they failed in this, they turned to the peasantry. Their campaign addressing the people became known as Narodnik Pokret. The movement was based on the idea that ordinary people have the ability to govern the country. As the Narodnik movement grew stronger, the government quickly decided to eradicate it. In response to the government's reaction, the radical branch of Narodnik resorted to terrorism. One after another, important officials were killed. Finally, after several attempts, Alexander II was assassinated in 1881. On the same day he proposed to call representatives to implement new reforms to meet the demands of the revolutionaries. Autocracy and reaction under Alexander III. Unlike his father, the new Tsar Alexander III, 1881–1894, was a convinced reactionary who ruled under the motto, sovereignty, orthodoxy, and nationalism, the motto that was in force at the time of Nicholas I. Alexander III, a convinced Slavophile, believed that Russia can be spared chaos if it resists subversive influences from the West, such as harmful ideologies, anarchism, socialism, nihilism. During his reign, Russia made an alliance with France, in order to oppose the increasingly powerful Germany with joint forces. The emperor's most powerful advisor was Constantine Pobedonostsev, the tutor of Alexander III and his son Nicholas and a member of the Holy Synod from 1880 to 1895. He taught his students to fear freedom of speech and to hate democracy, the constitution and the parliamentary system. Under Pobedonostsev, revolutionaries were persecuted and the policy of Russification was implemented by the empire. Nicholas II. Alexander was succeeded by his son Nicholas II, 1894–1917. The Industrial Revolution, which had an ever-increasing influence on conditions in Russia, created the forces that would finally overthrow the monarchy. The liberal elements among the industrial capitalists and nobility believed in peaceful social reforms and a constitutional monarchy, to be formed by the constitutional democrats or cadets as they were also called. The social revolutionaries followed the traditions of the Narodniks and demanded the distribution of land among those who actually cultivated it, the peasants. Another radical group was the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which was made up of supporters of Marxism in Russia. Gaining the support of radical intellectuals and the urban working class, they demanded a complete social, economic and political revolution. From 1903, the party was divided into two wings, the Mensheviks, or moderates, and the Bolsheviks, who were very radical. The Mensheviks believed that Russian socialism would develop gradually in a peaceful way, and that the Tsarist regime should be replaced by a democratic republic in which socialists would cooperate with liberal bourgeois parties. The Bolsheviks under the leadership of Vladimir Lenin demanded the creation of a small elite of professional revolutionaries, subject to strict party discipline, who would act as the vanguard of the proletariat in order to seize power by force. The military failure in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–1905, was a huge blow to the Tsarist regime. In January 1905, an incident known as Bloody Sunday took place when Father Gapon led a huge crowd of people to the Winter Palace in Petrograd to petition the Tsar. When the procession reached the palace, the Cossacks opened fire on the people, killing many. The Russian people were so affected by the massacre that a general strike was declared with the demand for the establishment of a democratic republic. This marked the beginning of the Russian Revolution of 1905. Soviets, workers' councils, were formed in most cities to manage revolutionary activities. Russia was paralyzed, the government was desperate. In October 1905, Nikolai reluctantly issued the famous October Manifesto, which allowed the creation of the People's Duma, legislative body, which was convened without delay. Voting rights were extended and no law could enter into force without the consent of the Duma. The group of moderates was satisfied with this, but the socialists rejected these changes as insufficient and tried to organize strikes. By the end of 1905, there were disagreements among the reformers, but the emperor's position was strengthened at that point.